I've been noticing something for years now, and it keeps showing up in different forms. A woman in her late 60s comes in for a routine visit. We're talking about blood pressure, maybe adjusting a medication. Everything seems fine. Then she mentions, almost as an aside, that she's having trouble buttoning her shirt in the morning. Not every day, just sometimes. She laughs it off, says her fingers feel stiff. But when I ask her to show me, it's not stiffness. Her fingers move fine. What I see is a tiny hesitation, a moment where her brain and her hand aren't quite syncing. She's compensating without realizing it, looking down more, using her other hand to steady the fabric. It's subtle. Most people wouldn't notice, but it's there. Another patient, a man in his early 70s, tells me he's fine. He drives, he cooks, he does his own shopping. But his daughter mentioned he's been leaving the stove on. Not often, maybe twice in the past few months. He insists it's nothing. He was distracted. He had a lot on his mind. And maybe that's true. But when I ask him to walk me through his morning routine, I notice something. He doesn't remember the sequence clearly, not because his memory is failing in the dramatic way we think of memory loss, but because the automatic flow of tasks, wake up, coffee, shower, get dressed, has become less automatic. He's thinking through each step now. And when you have to think through something that used to happen on its own, mistakes start to creep in. These moments don't fit neatly into the lists we see online. The articles that say, if you can do these 5 things, your brain is sharp. Or, if you struggle with these tasks, you're in trouble. The truth is more complicated. And I think we've been measuring the wrong things. Or at least, we've been measuring them in the wrong way. There's a belief that brain health in older adults is mostly about memory. Can you remember names? Can you recall what you did yesterday? Can you follow a conversation without losing the thread? And yes, memory matters. But the tasks that actually reveal how well your brain is coordinating with your body, how well it's managing the quiet background systems that keep you independent, those tasks are different. They're smaller. They're the ones people don't talk about because they seem too mundane to matter. Buttoning a shirt, unlocking a door with a key, pouring water from a full kettle without spilling, stepping over a threshold without hesitation. These aren't just physical actions, they're neurological events. Your brain has to process spatial information, coordinate fine motor control, predict the weight and resistance of objects, and adjust in real time. And it has to do all of this while you're thinking about something else. That's the key part, the automation, the fact that you don't have to focus on it. When that automation starts to fray, it doesn't announce itself. It shows up as small inefficiencies, a slight delay, a need to double-check, a moment where you have to stop and think about something you've done 10,000 times. And this is where the misconception starts, because we've been told that if these tasks get harder, it means your brain is declining, that you're losing function, that you need to do more puzzles, more crosswords, more memory exercises. But that's not the whole picture, not even close. The real issue isn't that your brain is weaker. It's that the way your brain is trying to do these tasks has changed. And often, that change is being driven by something we don't talk about enough. Tension, breath holding, postural compensation. The mechanics of how you're approaching the task, not the cognitive ability itself. Let me explain what I mean. Think about unlocking a door. It's a simple task. You've done it thousands of times. But if I asked you to describe exactly how you do it, you might struggle. Because it's automatic. Your hand knows the angle. Your fingers know the pressure. Your brain predicts the resistance of the lock and adjusts without you thinking about it. Now imagine you're in a hurry, or you're carrying grocery bags, or you're worried about something. What happens? You tense up, your shoulders rise, your breath gets shallow, and suddenly the key doesn't turn as smoothly. You have to jiggle it. You have to focus. The task that was automatic now requires attention. That's not a brain problem, that's a mechanical problem. But because it involves a task that requires brain-body coordination, it feels like a cognitive issue. And when it happens more often, when you start noticing it in multiple areas of your day, it's easy to assume your brain is the problem. But what if the real issue is that you're doing these tasks in a state of low-level tension that your brain has to work around? This is the misconception I want to unpack. The idea that if a task gets harder, it means your cognitive function is declining. That belief feels true because the task does get harder. You do notice the difficulty, but the cause isn't always what we think, and the solution isn't always about training your brain to be sharper. Sometimes it's about changing the conditions under which your brain is trying to operate. I see this most clearly with breathing, not the deep, deliberate breathing people talk about for relaxation. I'm talking about the shallow, held breath that happens when you're concentrating, when you're threading a needle, when you're opening a jar, when you're trying to remember where you put your keys. You hold your breath. Most people don't realize they're doing it, but when you hold your breath, even for a few seconds, you're signaling to your nervous system that something is difficult, that you need to brace. And when your nervous system gets that signal, it tightens your muscles. It narrows your focus. It shifts you into a mode that's designed for effort, not for flow. And here's the problem. The tasks we're talking about, the ones that reveal brain health, they require flow. They require your brain to coordinate multiple systems without interference. When you add tension, when you add breath holding, when you add the subtle bracing that comes from trying too hard, you're making the task harder than it needs to be. You're creating friction, and over time, that friction becomes the new normal. You start to believe the task itself is harder. But it's not the task. It's the way you're doing it. Let me give you a concrete example. Pouring water from a kettle. Simple task. But as people get older, I hear complaints about this more often than you'd expect. The kettle feels heavier. The pour is less controlled. Water spills. And the assumption is that grip strength is declining or hand coordination is off. But when I watch someone pour, what I often see is this. They grip the handle too tightly. They hold their breath. They tense their shoulder. They're pouring from a position of effort, not ease. And because of that, the small adjustments your hand would normally make, the tiny corrections that keep the pour smooth, those don't happen. The tension blocks them. Now, if I ask that person to take a breath before they pick up the kettle, to exhale slowly as they pour, to let their shoulder drop, the pour changes. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The water flows more smoothly. The hand adjusts more naturally. The task feels easier, not because their brain suddenly got better at coordinating movement, but because the interference was removed. This is what I mean when I say the problem isn't always cognitive. It's often mechanical, and the mechanics are being shaped by stress, by breath, by posture, by the accumulated tension of doing 100 small tasks in a state of low-level bracing. So when we talk about tasks that reveal brain health, we need to ask a different question. Not just, can you do this task? But, how are you doing it? Are you doing it with ease, or are you doing it with effort? Are you breathing, or are you holding your breath? Are you relaxed, or are you braced? Because the same task, done in two different states, will feel completely different. And over time, if you're always doing it in a state of tension, your brain starts to associate that task with difficulty. It becomes harder. Not because your brain has declined, but because the conditions have changed. Now, this doesn't mean that cognitive decline isn't real. It is. And there are tasks that do become harder because of changes in the brain itself. But I think we've been too quick to assume that every difficulty is a sign of decline. And in doing so, we've missed a huge opportunity, because if the difficulty is coming from tension, from breath holding, from mechanical interference, then we can do something about it. We don't have to accept it as inevitable. The tasks that matter most, the ones that actually reveal how well your brain is coordinating with your body, they're not the ones we usually focus on. We focus on memory tests, on reaction time, on puzzle solving, and those things have value, but they don't tell you much about the quiet, automatic systems that keep you independent, The systems that let you button your shirt without thinking, that let you unlock a door without fumbling, that let you step over a threshold without hesitation. Those systems are what matter most in daily life. And those systems are incredibly sensitive to tension. Let me talk about the door latch metaphor for a moment, because I think it captures this idea well. Imagine a door latch that's not opening smoothly. You turn the handle, but it sticks. You have to jiggle it. You have to use more force. Now, you could assume the latch is broken, that it needs to be replaced. But often, the problem isn't the latch itself. It's that the door has shifted slightly, or the strike plate is misaligned, or there's a tiny bit of rust. The latch is fine. It's the conditions around it that have changed. And if you fix those conditions, the latch works smoothly again. That's what's happening with these daily tasks. The latch is your brain-body coordination, and when it's not working smoothly, we assume the latch is broken. But often, the problem is the alignment, the conditions. The tension and breath holding and postural bracing that's making the task harder than it needs to be. And if we address those conditions, the latch works again. This is where the practical side comes in, because recognizing the problem is one thing, doing something about it is another. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting you add new tasks to your day. I'm not suggesting you do more exercises or more brain training. What I'm suggesting is a timing change. A gentle shift in when and how you do the tasks you're already doing. Start with one task, something small, something you do every day, buttoning a shirt, unlocking a door, pouring coffee. Before you do it, pause. Take one full breath, not a deep breath, just a normal breath, in and out. Let your shoulders drop, then do the task. Don't try to do it perfectly. Don't try to do it faster. Just do it with less effort, with less bracing. And notice what happens. For many people, this small change makes a surprising difference. The task feels easier, not because they practiced it more, but because they've removed the interference. They've given their brain the conditions it needs to coordinate smoothly. And over time, this becomes a habit. You start to notice when you're holding your breath, when you're tensing up, and you adjust, you pause, you breathe. You let the tension go before you start the task. Now, this doesn't fix everything. It doesn't reverse cognitive decline if that's what's happening. It doesn't make you 20 years younger, but it does something important. It separates the real difficulty from the added difficulty. It lets you see what your brain can actually do when it's not working against tension. And for many people, that's a revelation. Because they realize that a lot of the difficulty they've been experiencing isn't inevitable. It's not a sign of irreversible decline. It's a sign that they've been doing these tasks in a way that makes them harder than they need to be. I want to talk about expectations for a moment, because I think this is where a lot of disappointment comes from. People hear advice like this, and they expect immediate transformation. They expect that if they just breathe better, or relax more, or change their posture, suddenly everything will be easy again. And that's not realistic. What this approach does is reduce unnecessary difficulty. It removes interference, but it doesn't eliminate the natural changes that come with aging. Your reaction time will still be slower than it was at 30. Your balance will still require more attention. Your memory will still have gaps. That's normal. That's part of being human. What this approach gives you is clarity. It lets you see which difficulties are mechanical and which are neurological. And that matters, because mechanical difficulties can be addressed. Neurological difficulties need different strategies. But when everything is lumped together as brain decline, you lose the ability to distinguish. You lose the ability to respond appropriately. I've had patients who started paying attention to their breath and their tension during daily tasks, and after a few weeks, they told me they felt more capable, not stronger, not sharper, but more capable, because they weren't fighting themselves as much. They weren't adding extra effort where it wasn't needed, and that made space for their brain to work the way it's supposed to work, quietly, automatically, without interference. This doesn't mean you ignore real problems. If you're having significant difficulty with tasks that used to be easy, if you're noticing consistent patterns of confusion or disorientation, you should talk to a doctor. Those things matter. But before you assume it's all cognitive decline, before you assume your brain is failing, it's worth asking whether you're giving your brain the conditions it needs to succeed. Whether you're breathing, whether you're relaxed, whether you're doing these tasks in a state of ease or a state of effort. I think one of the hardest things about getting older is the loss of automaticity, the feeling that things that used to be effortless now require thought. And that loss can feel like a loss of self, like you're not as capable as you used to be. But sometimes that loss isn't about capability. It's about interference. It's about the accumulated tension of living in a world that constantly asks you to do more, to hurry, to multitask, to never fully relax. And when you carry that tension into the small tasks of daily life, those tasks get harder. Not because you've lost the ability to do them, but because you're doing them under conditions that make them harder. So the question isn't just, can you still do these tasks? The question is, how are you doing them? Are you doing them with ease, or are you fighting yourself? Are you breathing, or are you holding your breath? Are you relaxed, or are you braced? Because the same task done in two different ways will reveal two different things about your brain. One will reveal decline, the other will reveal interference. And knowing the difference matters. I want to come back to the idea of the 5 tasks, because that's the framework people are familiar with. The idea that there are specific tasks that, if you can still do them easily, mean your brain is strong. And I think that framework is useful, but it's incomplete because it focuses on the task itself, not on how you're doing it. And how you're doing it is often more revealing than whether you can do it. The tasks that matter most are the ones that require coordination between multiple systems. Fine motor control, spatial awareness, timing, balance. These are the systems that decline most noticeably with age. And these are the systems that are most sensitive to tension and breath holding. So when we assess these tasks, we need to assess them under the right conditions. Not when you're rushed, not when you're stressed, not when you're holding your breath and bracing, but when you're calm, when you're breathing, when you're giving your brain the best chance to coordinate smoothly. And here's what I've noticed. When people do this, when they start paying attention to the conditions under which they do these tasks, they often discover that they're more capable than they thought, that the difficulty they were experiencing was partly self-created, not intentionally, not because they were doing anything wrong, but because they'd fallen into patterns of tension and effort that were making everything harder. This doesn't mean you can think your way out of aging. You can't. The brain changes. The body changes. That's reality. But within those changes, there's a range. There's a spectrum of how well you can function. And where you fall on that spectrum depends partly on the conditions you create, on whether you're working with your brain or against it, on whether you're giving it the space and ease it needs to coordinate smoothly, or whether you're adding layers of tension and interference that make every task harder than it needs to be. I think about this a lot when I see patients who are frustrated with themselves, who feel like they're declining faster than they should, who compare themselves to friends or family members and wonder why they're struggling more. And often, when I dig into how they're doing their daily tasks, I find patterns of tension, patterns of breath holding, patterns of rushing and multitasking and never fully relaxing. And those patterns have consequences. They make the brain's job harder. They create friction where there doesn't need to be friction. So the practical takeaway is this. Pick one small task, something you do every day. And for the next week, before you do that task, pause. Take one breath. Let your shoulders drop. Then do the task with as little effort as possible. Don't try to do it perfectly. Don't try to do it fast. Just do it with ease. And notice what changes. Notice how it feels. Notice whether it gets easier. For some people, this will make a noticeable difference right away. For others, it will take longer. But either way, it's information. It's data about how much of the difficulty you're experiencing is mechanical and how much is neurological. And that data is valuable because it tells you where to focus. It tells you what you can change and what you need to accept. I also want to acknowledge that this approach requires patience. It requires a willingness to slow down. And in a culture that values speed and efficiency, that's not easy. But the brain doesn't work on the timeline of efficiency. It works on the timeline of coordination. And coordination requires space. It requires time. It requires conditions that allow multiple systems to sync up without interference. When you rush, when you tense up, when you hold your breath, you're removing that space. You're making coordination harder. And over time, that adds up. This is especially true for tasks that involve fine motor control, buttoning a shirt, threading a needle, using a key. These tasks require precise coordination between vision, touch, and movement, and that coordination is incredibly sensitive to tension. Even a small amount of shoulder tension can throw off the alignment. Even a few seconds of breath holding can reduce the smoothness of the movement. So if you're struggling with these tasks, before you assume it's cognitive decline, try doing them in a state of ease. Try breathing through them. Try letting your shoulders relax. And see what happens. Now, I know some people will hear this and think it sounds too simple, too easy, like it can't possibly make a difference. And I understand that skepticism. But I've seen it work too many times to dismiss it. I've seen patients who were convinced they were losing function, who were starting to worry about dementia, who discovered that a significant portion of their difficulty was coming from tension, from the way they were approaching tasks, not from the brain itself. And that's not to minimize the reality of cognitive decline. It's real. It happens. But it's not the only thing happening. And when we treat every difficulty as a sign of decline, we miss the other factors. We miss the mechanical interference. We miss the tension and the breath holding and the accumulated stress of doing 100 small tasks in a state of low-level bracing. And those things matter. They matter a lot. So the 5 tasks, whatever they are, they're not just tests. They're opportunities. Opportunities to notice how you're doing them. Opportunities to see whether you're working with your brain or against it. Opportunities to remove interference and give your brain the conditions it needs to function well. And that's valuable, not because it reverses aging, but because it maximizes what you're capable of within the reality of aging. I want to end with this thought. The goal isn't to do these tasks perfectly. The goal isn't to prove that your brain is as sharp as it was at 40. The goal is to do them with ease, to do them in a way that feels sustainable, to do them in a way that doesn't leave you exhausted or frustrated or convinced that you're failing. Because you're not failing. You're navigating a set of changes that everyone navigates, and how you navigate them, the conditions you create, the way you approach these small daily tasks, that makes a difference. If you found this useful, go ahead and hit the like button. Subscribe if you want more conversations like this. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes of Everyday Health Podcast. And here's a question for you. What's one small task that's gotten harder for you in the past few years? And have you noticed whether tension or breath holding might be playing a role? Think about it.